Thank you. And the question is that the motion be agreed to, and I'll give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. I thank the member for McNamara for bringing forward an important motion. Our treatment of vulnerable people seeking asylum speaks to who we are as a nation. It's an issue of great concern to many people in my electorate of Warringah and indeed to many people in Australia more broadly. As the motion rightly points out, and has, I would say, been ignored by members of government, the program of alternative detention costs taxpayers tens of millions of dollars per year and continues despite the physical and mental health impacts of those who remain in detention. Asylum seekers being held under these arrangements face not only disconnection and uncertainty, but also face a greater health risk during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the past month, nearly 1/3 of refugees and asylum seekers at Melbourne's Park Hotel have tested positive for COVID-19, and the number is expected to grow. At least one refugee has been taken to hospital. It's one of the reasons that the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, Amnesty International and the Australian Medical Association, as well as more than 1,000 medical professionals, have been calling for all people held in alternative places of detention to be released into the community. Across the immigration detention network, vaccination rates are significantly lower than in the community at large. Only 61% have had one dose and 54% are fully vaccinated. I call on the government to increase the vaccination efforts for all of those vulnerable in those environments and expedite the release of asylum seekers and refugees into the community. We're not talking about a large group of people here, and some of the narrative that comes from members of government really is ridiculous when it comes to this. There are currently 114 people being detained in the alternative places of detention. Earlier this year, Jacinda Ardern reaffirmed New Zealand's offer to resettle them there in New Zealand. So again, I reiterate the call from Craig Foster and Sonny Bill Williams and many in our community. It's time to call game over and ask why won't the government accept or even consider this offer. 1,440 refugees are being held in onshore immigration detention, and there are over 500 people in the community detention, including 175 children. That is shameful. The Biloela family can continue to linger. That number in community detention includes them, 3 of whom have been granted year-long visas, but the youngest daughter is a pawn in the play from the government and not being granted that same status, and hence they remain in community detention in Perth, indefinitely suffering, and they're prevented from being able to return to their home. It's time to end this charade of saying that this has in some way got anything to do with our border protection. And finally, the Afghan evacuation. I'd like to think that in these circumstances we have actually had some common sense and some humanity. I want to thank Minister Payne and Minister Hawke and their officers for their cooperation and assistance during the recent evacuation efforts upon the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. I provided some assistance in getting female athletes out of the country, and it was humbling and eye-opening to see their experience for me and for my staff, and I thank the ministers and their teams for their assistance. People like Craig Foster and his tireless efforts, as well as Nikki Dryden, Alison Batterson and Kurt Fernley, and many, many others who were involved in this effort. So thank you for your dedication to getting these very vulnerable young women and their families to safety. I'm continuing to work closely with groups supporting those who have made it here to Australia, and I will be following how they go in resettling here. And there are still so many trying to flee Afghanistan. The Sydney Alliance is one such group who will be meeting with next week to discuss their concerns with the government's response to the ongoing situation in Afghanistan. We need to expand our humanitarian visa scheme to include 20,000 places for Afghan refugees. We need to assist the Afghan Australians with urgent family reunification applications, and we do need to grant permanent protection to Afghan nationals already in the community or in Australian immigration detention facilities. It was devastating to hear of the death of an interpreter who had assisted Australian Defence Force officials in our mission in Afghanistan earlier this week. Sadly, I'm sure it's not the only one. So I urge the government and members of government to do more to assist the provision of temporary visas to those that are very much in need and that have helped us. There are still so many questions around how we are treating these most vulnerable people. And there's always a lot of fear-mongering that somehow this goes to broader border policies, but at the end of the day, it's our humanity that's at stake. And unfortunately, our actions does not say much for the humanity in Australia.